In a town designed for peace, imposters lurked hiding behind sham authority, while unsuspecting families were left vulnerable. However, they made a grave mistake when they crossed paths with Leo's father, Mark Johnson, a Navy SEAL veteran. What started as one horrifying moment ignited a battle for justice that would shake the entire community to its core. Stick around to discover how this fierce fight for truth unfolded and why this time genuine justice could not be denied. The sun dipped low behind the swaying palm trees of Palm Creek, casting a soft golden glow over the tranquil neighborhood. A gentle breeze carried the salty tang of the nearby ocean, and for a fleeting moment, everything felt untouched, almost unnervingly perfect. Mark Johnson knelt beside the mailbox at the edge of his driveway, tightening a loose screw, the cool metal, a familiar sensation, against his calloused fingers. Nearby, his 9-year-old son Leo zipped back and forth on his skateboard along the smooth sidewalk. Bursts of laughter punctuated the air each time he landed a clumsy, endearing trick. The fading light caught Leo's scuffed sneakers, making them flash silver and blue with every kick and push like tiny sparks dancing across the pavement. Mark glanced up occasionally, a quiet smile playing on his lips, savoring that rare peace only a parent truly understands, watching their child simply be a child, free and full of life. He was just about to call Leo in for dinner when an unfamiliar rumble shattered the stillness. A battered gray van, coated in dust and grime, rolled slowly down the street. It bore no logos, no official plates, nothing to indicate it belonged in their quiet enclave. Suddenly, it pulled up directly in front of their house tires, crunching against the curb. Mark stiffened slightly, his years of Navy training sharpening his instincts automatically. Before he could fully process the situation, 2 men jumped out. They wore mismatched dark uniforms adorned with bright yellow HOA enforcement lettering printed sloppily across cheap-looking vests. Their boots pounded the asphalt as they stormed toward Leo without a word of greeting or warning. One of them barked, "Hey, stop right there!" His voice was gruff, impatient, and laced with an authority he clearly hadn't earned. Leo, still coasting on his board, blinked in confusion and rolled to a slow halt. "You can't skateboard here, HOA rules. You're trespassing," the man snapped, jerking his thumb vaguely over his shoulder toward a clipboard he wasn't even holding. Leo pushed his board back slightly with the tip of his sneaker, looking genuinely puzzled. "But I live here," he said, his small voice tentative but firm. "That's my house right there. My dad's right there." He pointed toward Mark, who had risen halfway from his crouch, a tight knot forming in his chest. The men didn't even glance over. Instead, the bigger of the two lunged forward and grabbed Leo's wrist roughly. "You'll learn what happens when you don't listen," he growled menacingly. Leo cried out instinctively, trying to pull away, but the man's grip tightened with cruel indifference. Mark moved fast, but he was just a heartbeat too late. In a horrifying split second, there was an awful, sickening crunch, a sound utterly alien to the warm, safe world of suburban sidewalks and family homes. Leo's scream ripped through the air, sharp and raw, cutting through the evening calm like a blade. His skateboard clattered uselessly to the ground as he crumpled onto the sidewalk, clutching his injured hand to his chest. Blood immediately began to seep between his small fingers, staining the front of his light t-shirt and spreading dark patches of red. Mark's world narrowed instantaneously to that single devastating sight: his son hurt, crying broken. He heard nothing else, saw nothing else as he charged across the lawn, fury and fear pounding in his ears like drumbeats. The two men backed away quickly now, shouting something incoherent about discipline and rules, their fake authority crumbling the moment they realized who they were dealing with. Mark reached Leo first, dropping to his knees, his hands trembling as he carefully tried to assess the damage without causing more pain. Leo sobbed, trying desperately to be brave, but the agony was too much for a child to hide. Mark looked up, his eyes locking onto the two men, with a cold, focused intensity that made them freeze in their tracks. Every fiber of his being screamed for action, for retribution, but Leo needed him now. Gritting his teeth, Mark pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed 911 with one hand, the other never leaving Leo's trembling back. "Stay with me, buddy. I've got you," he whispered, forcing calm into his voice, even as rage boiled just beneath the surface. Neighbors were starting to emerge, stepping onto porches and sidewalks, drawn by the commotion. Whispers turned into pointing, and soon phones were out recording. Someone called out that the police were on their way, but Mark didn't look away from his son. He couldn't. He saw the unwavering trust in Leo's teary eyes. Trust that his dad would make it right, would protect him no matter what. And in that precise moment, Mark Johnson silently vowed that nothing would stand in the way of justice for his boy. Not tonight, not ever. Mark dropped the wrench without a second thought. The tool clattered uselessly against the concrete as he surged forward, driven by something deeper than mere instinct. His heart pounded in his chest, a heavy, painful rhythm, echoing louder with every step toward his injured son. "What did you do?" he roared, his voice slicing through the thickening tension like a thunderclap. Without hesitation, Mark seized the nearest man by the front of his cheap vest, the flimsy material bunching tightly in his fist. The so-called officer stumbled back, his bravado evaporating instantly. His partner, pale and wide-eyed, fumbled with something at his belt, what looked like a crude ID badge. But Mark didn't need to see it. He already knew these men weren't law enforcement. They weren't even legitimate HOA representatives. They were pretenders, imposters, hiding behind meaningless props. Around them, the peaceful facade of the neighborhood was visibly cracking. Doors opened wider. More neighbors stepped onto their porches, drawn by the escalating drama. Some held up phones recording, while others simply stood frozen, torn between disbelief and rising concern. Somewhere nearby, a voice shouted clearly, "Call 911." But Mark didn't turn his head. His entire world had narrowed to the trembling child crumpled on the ground, and the cowards who had dared to hurt him. His trained eyes scanned the imposters with brutal efficiency. No real officer would slouch like that. No true professional would carry such worn-out gear or wear sneakers instead of issued boots. Their stances were all wrong, loose, careless. Their movements betrayed uncertainty, not practiced discipline. These men were frauds, dangerous frauds. Yet even these tactical details barely registered. Mark's gaze kept snapping back to Leo, to the way his son sat hunched over, clutching his injured hand close. Blood dripped steadily from between Leo's small fingers, splattering dark spots onto the pale sidewalk. His face was scrunched in pain, tears streaming freely down his cheeks as he rocked slightly back and forth, desperate to ease an agony no child should ever endure. Mark's gut twisted so hard it nearly stole his breath. It was one thing to witness pain on distant battlefields. It was entirely another to see it reflected in the broken body of your own child. Rage ignited in his chest, hot, consuming, but controlled, focused, in a way only years of intense discipline could forge. This wasn't some random act of violence. This was personal. They had crossed an unforgivable line. Mark tightened his grip on the man's vest, jerking him forward just enough to strip away whatever thin veneer of authority he'd been clinging to. The imposter stammered something about enforcing HOA regulations, but the words were meaningless noise, hollow and cowardly. Mark's voice dropped low, cold as steel. "You touched the wrong kid," he said, each syllable heavy with an unspoken promise. The man squirmed, his eyes darting nervously toward the gathering crowd, toward his partner, toward the battered van idling a few yards away, as if seeking an escape route. But Mark didn't release him. Not yet. A second later, the distinct wail of real police sirens cut through the thick tension like a blade. The fake officers stiffened their false bravado, finally collapsing into raw panic. They knew their time was up. Mark let the man go with a hard shove, sending him stumbling back toward his terrified partner. He then dropped to one knee beside Leo, his hands suddenly gentle as he reached for his son. "I'm here, buddy," he murmured, his voice cracking despite himself. "It's going to be okay. I promise you." Leo whimpered, but tried to stay brave, blinking up at his father through a blur of pain and tears. Mark pressed his hand lightly to Leo's back, offering what little comfort he could while keeping his eyes locked firmly on the imposters. Around them, more neighbors were closing in, their faces etched with outrage and disbelief. Cameras captured every second. Witnesses whispered among themselves, building a tidal wave of collective fury that Mark could feel gathering strength. Still, none of it mattered more than the small, broken figure on the ground before him. As the sirens grew louder, closing in, a deep certainty settled over Mark. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Justice wasn't something you simply waited for. It was something you made happen. And tonight, Mark Johnson would ensure these men, and anyone else who thought they could prey on the innocent, would learn exactly what that meant. The fake officers exchanged a panicked glance, their flimsy confidence unraveling with every frantic heartbeat. They started backing away, inching toward their beat-up gray van, like cornered animals seeking any possible exit. One muttered something under his breath, scanning the growing crowd and the flashing phones with mounting fear. But Mark Johnson was already moving faster than either man could react. He stepped deliberately between them and their vehicle, blocking their path with the solid, unyielding presence of a man who had faced far worse threats and never flinched. In one swift, practiced motion, he reached out and snatched the cheap plastic badge dangling from the belt of the man he had confronted earlier. The imposter tried to jerk away, but Mark was too quick, his hand closing around the worthless prop with absolute certainty. He raised the badge high into the golden light of the setting sun, turning it so everyone nearby could see the truth for themselves. It was a joke. No hologram, no official seal, not even the correct font. It was just a prop, nothing more. "Fake," Mark growled, his voice low and thunderous, carrying across the stunned silence that had fallen over the crowd. He turned his hard stare back to the two men who now looked like they wished the pavement would swallow them whole. "You're not HOA. You're not security. You're criminals." The words landed like hammer blows. There was no mistaking the finality in Mark's tone. Around them, the murmurs of the neighbors grew louder, angrier, a low rumble of outrage building with every passing second. And then, slicing through the tension, the unmistakable wail of approaching sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights flickered against the houses as two patrol cars screeched to a halt at the curb. Real officers' uniforms, crisp movements precise, poured out, weapons drawn but held in measured, trained readiness, signaling for everyone to step back. Mark did not resist, when an officer gently guided him aside. He had made his point. Now it was time for official justice to take its course. The two fake officers tried to protest, hands raised in mock surrender, but it was far too late. One made a desperate lunge toward the van, but a swift professional move from a deputy sent him sprawling face down on the asphalt, a knee pinning him firmly in place. The other was yanked backward and cuffed before he could utter another word. One, in a final act of foolishness, tried to resist twisting and shoving against the officer's grip. He was met with a firm, controlled baton strike to the side, professional precise just enough to bring him down without causing undue harm. His cries of protest quickly turned into groans as he was pinned alongside his partner. Mark watched it all unfold with cold, quiet satisfaction. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer force of the adrenaline and emotion coursing through him. Nevertheless, he kept them steady on Leo's small shoulders. Leo was still curled against him, sobbing quietly, now his uninjured hand clutching the fabric of Mark's shirt like a lifeline. Mark bent lower, resting his forehead gently against Leo's hair. "You're safe now, buddy," he whispered, the promise firm and steady. Around them, neighbors continued to film, whisper, and shake their heads in disbelief. Some called out words of encouragement to Mark. Others simply stared wide-eyed, realizing just how close they had all come to letting real danger creep unnoticed into their seemingly safe lives. The officers moved swiftly, securing the scene, taking statements, and gathering evidence. Throughout it all, Mark stayed right where he was cradling his son, feeling the slow, powerful return of control and the unshakable certainty that these men would answer for what they had done. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, a sharp contrast to the warm evening that now felt like a distant memory. Fluorescent lights buzzed relentlessly overhead, casting a cold, clinical glow over the emergency room. Mark sat motionless beside the small hospital bed where Leo lay, his injured hand wrapped in thick, careful bandages that looked far too large for such a small arm. The boy's face was pale against the crisp white sheets, his features tight with exhaustion and lingering pain even in his restless sleep. Mark had barely moved since the doctors delivered the news. 4 fingers on Leo's right hand were badly crushed, the bones shattered in multiple places. Recovery wouldn't be simple. There would be surgeries, months of physical therapy, and possibly even lasting damage that no amount of medicine could completely erase. The words had hit Mark like physical blows, each one heavier than the last. He had spent years on battlefields half a world away, faced storms and fire and unimaginable chaos. Yet nothing, not a single moment, had prepared him for the profound helplessness of sitting here, unable to undo the harm inflicted upon his own son. His fists clenched unconsciously on his knees, nails digging into his palms, the rage still simmering just below the surface. This wasn't just an accident. This wasn't fate. This was caused by selfishness, by greed, by criminal negligence, and someone would answer for it. He leaned forward slightly, brushing a loose strand of hair off Leo's forehead, careful not to disturb the boy's fragile sleep. The small gesture was the only outlet for the burning anger in his chest, threatening to erupt. Later, across the room, a quiet knock sounded at the door. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their faces grim but respectful. Mark rose silently, stepping away from the bed, but never turning his back on his son. One of the officers, a tall man with a clipped, direct tone, got straight to the point. The men who had hurt Leo weren't just imposters. They were former employees of a shady security contractor dismissed months ago for fraudulent practices. Background checks revealed a disturbing pattern, a string of petty crimes, falsified credentials, and documented intimidation tactics. Somehow, they had slipped through the cracks and begun operating independently, exploiting fear and confusion under the false banner of HOA authority to collect bogus fines from unsuspecting residents. Mark listened intently without interrupting every word, hardening the resolve, already solidifying within him like steel. The officers continued explaining that the Homeowners Association itself had demonstrably failed to verify the legitimacy of the enforcement team they had loosely affiliated with. No thorough background checks had been conducted, no proper oversight implemented. It seemed easier, they implied, to outsource unpleasant tasks to third parties and conveniently look the other way. That specific cowardice, that negligence, had opened the door for criminals to walk directly into their neighborhood and into his family's life. Mark's jaw tightened. It wasn't enough to punish the men who had physically laid hands on Leo. The ones who had allowed it to happen, through negligence, laziness, or willful indifference, had to be held accountable too. He thanked the officers, his voice low and measured, then returned to the bedside. Leo shifted in his sleep, a small pained whimper escaping his lips. Mark sat back down, resting a hand lightly on his son's back. His mind was already working, methodically, relentlessly. There would be a reckoning, not driven by vengeance, but by duty. For Leo, for every family that trusted their community to be a safe haven. Mark had fought to protect his country. Now he would fight just as fiercely to protect his son's future. And this time, he would make damn sure the battle was fought on his terms. Mark didn't waste a single moment. The day after Leo's initial surgery, while his son rested under the careful watch of nurses and family, Mark began meticulously building his case. Every instinct, every ounce of training, honed over years of military service, locked into place with practiced precision. He wasn't solely driven by anger anymore. He was driven by unwavering purpose. He started by systematically collecting eyewitness accounts from neighbors who had witnessed the confrontation. Door to door he went, speaking calmly, methodically, earning trust, not with force, but with quiet, determined authority. People responded. Videos surfaced, grainy footage from doorbell cameras, shaky cell phone clips. Each one became another crucial piece of the puzzle falling definitively into place. Mark meticulously catalogued every recording, noting timestamps, angles, and details that others might have easily missed. Next, he turned his focused attention to the HOA itself, diving deep into public records bylaws and existing contracts. He quickly unearthed glaring gaps in protocol procedural failures that had allowed dangerous imposters to roam freely under the HOA's willfully blind eye. His case wasn't just fueled by emotion. It was becoming undeniably ironclad. He constructed it the way a seasoned tactician would plan a critical operation layer by layer, piece by meticulous piece, until there was absolutely nowhere left for the guilty parties to hide. By the end of the week, Mark was ready. When the HOA called an emergency meeting at the Palm Creek Community Center, they likely expected routine questions, perhaps a few scattered complaints. They certainly didn't expect Mark Johnson. The meeting room, usually half empty during regular sessions, was packed wall to wall. Residents stood shoulder to shoulder along the back and spilled out into the hallways. Parents clutched their children's hands tightly. Seniors leaned forward intently in their chairs, faces lined with worry and palpable expectation. When Mark took the floor, silence fell like a heavy curtain. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded attention. Calmly, he laid a thick folder on the podium. Then, one by one, he presented his evidence. A printed, detailed timeline of the imposter's activities, photos comparing the fake IDs to legitimate ones. Multiple video clips showing the assault on Leo, projected clearly on a large screen. The images grainy but unmistakable, undeniable. Witness statements, official police reports. Every word Mark spoke was measured factual, irrefutable. He wasn't asking for sympathy, he was demanding accountability. As the presentation unfolded, the mood in the room shifted palpably. Shock rippled through the crowd. First, a collective gasp here, a stifled cry there. Then came the anger. Low murmurs of outrage grew steadily louder, swelling like a rising tide. Mothers pulled their children closer. Fathers exchanged grim, knowing looks. Some residents wiped tears from their eyes. Others clenched their fists tightly in their laps. At the head table, the president of the HOA, a man once regarded with perhaps distant respect, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His face flushed beet red, and when he finally attempted to speak, his voice cracked under the sheer weight of the room's unified judgment. He stammered out weak excuses about miscommunication and trusting the wrong contractors, but the words fell utterly flat. No one was buying it. Mark didn't interrupt. He didn't have to. The truth laid bare was louder than any defensive speech could ever be. By the time Mark finished, the energy in the room was electric. Palm Creek wasn't looking at Mark Johnson as just another resident anymore. They saw him as the man who had stood up when no one else would, the man who would now lead them in demanding real, lasting change. With the lawsuit officially filed and the existing HOA council effectively forced into resignation under immense pressure, Mark didn't slow down. Instead, he channeled his energy forward. He met with legal advisors, relentlessly pushed for stricter community regulations, and demanded comprehensive mandatory background checks for anyone performing any kind of work within the community boundaries. News of Leo's injury had stirred more than just outrage. It had sparked tangible change. Local leaders publicly promised reforms. Parents who had once remained silent now spoke up fiercely, determined to protect their families. Meanwhile, prosecutors moved quickly against the imposters, stacking multiple serious charges. Assault, fraud, impersonating officials, leaving little room for escape. Mark attended every preliminary meeting, every court hearing, standing tall. Not just as a devastated father, but as the unwavering voice of an entire community that refused to be silenced or intimidated ever again. A month passed. Life in Palm Creek, though forever changed by the incident, was beginning to show signs of healing. Leo sat at the kitchen table, his right arm still encased in a heavy cast. He concentrated fiercely, trying to guide a spoon filled with cereal to his mouth using his left hand. Every movement was slow, clumsy, and visibly frustrating, but he never gave up. Mark watched from across the table, his heart swelling with a complex mixture of immense pride and quiet sorrow. Leo gritted his teeth with every dropped spoon, every accidental spill, but he always picked it back up and tried again. The boy's sheer determination mirrored everything Mark had ever tried to teach him about courage, not the absence of struggle, but the resolute refusal to be defeated by it. Outside the walls of their home, Mark's fight had grown into something bigger than he ever anticipated. Inspired by the outpouring of support and the realization that his family's ordeal was likely not unique, he established a non-profit organization. Its mission to support families who had suffered from abuse, negligence, or overreach by homeowners associations. The fund provided crucial legal resources, access to counseling, and perhaps most importantly, a public platform for stories that otherwise might have been buried in bureaucracy and silence. Word spread quickly. Families from neighboring communities and even other states began reaching out, some seeking help, others offering support and sharing similar experiences. What had begun as one father's personal mission to defend his son was rapidly evolving into a genuine movement for systemic change. Mark found himself busier than ever juggling physical therapy appointments for Leo with organizing meetings, coordinating with attorneys, and speaking at community events. Yet he carried the weight with a quiet sense of profound purpose. Every time he looked at Leo's determined little face, concentrating so hard on regaining his dexterity, he was reminded exactly why he fought so relentlessly. The town of Palm Creek, once perhaps too content to look the other way, had definitively found its collective voice. Residents demanded better standards, insisted on greater accountability from their local governance, and pushed for a permanent end to unchecked arbitrary authority within their neighborhoods. New regulations were drafted, stricter controls were implemented, and a renewed sense of unity flowed through the streets where suspicion and fear had recently lingered. Ultimately, it all culminated one bright Saturday afternoon. The city held a public ceremony at Town Hall to recognize the individuals who had made a significant difference in the community's recent turnaround. Families gathered on the wide steps beneath fluttering banners, children laughing and playing under the warm sun. Mark wasn't seeking recognition, but when his name was called, the crowd erupted in sustained, heartfelt cheers. Clutching Leo carefully in his arms, Mark walked up to the stage. The mayor shook his hand firmly and presented him with a framed certificate of gratitude, acknowledging his exceptional courage and service to the community. Cameras flashed. Applause echoed through the plaza. Leo beamed proudly from the safety of his father's embrace, waving his good hand shyly to the applauding crowd. Mark looked out over the sea of faces. Some familiar, others new, but all of them united by something stronger than anger or fear-hope. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Mark allowed himself to breathe deeply, truly relax. He felt the immense weight of the past weeks lift, replaced by a profound sense of hard-won peace. Justice hadn't come easily. It hadn't erased the physical or emotional scars, but it had been fought for and ultimately won. As he held Leo a little higher for the crowd to see, Mark's heart swelled with gratitude. His boy was healing. His community was stronger, more vigilant. And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed that no matter how deep the wrong, the fight for what was right could and indeed would prevail. Mark stood on the front porch of his home, arms crossed loosely over his chest, watching the scene unfold before him with a quiet, unshakable pride. Leo was out in the front yard, laughing freely as he kicked a soccer ball back and forth with a group of neighborhood kids. His cast was finally off. His movements were still a little careful, tentative, but growing stronger and more confident every single day. The sun bathed the street in a warm, golden hue, and for the first time in what felt like a long while, Mark allowed himself to truly savor the simple moment without bracing for the next potential blow.